Long before Marilyn Monroe stood above a subway grate, there was a different icon of beauty and style, the Gibson Girl. At the turn of the 19th century, artist Charles Dana Gibson began creating pen and ink illustrations of beautiful women with narrow waists, slender necks, and hair cascading from voluminous bouffants and chignons. For decades, the Gibson Girl became the feminine ideal across the West, and millions of women from all classes and backgrounds strove to achieve a similar look. While Gibson claimed that the character of the Gibson Girl was an amalgamation of the women he encountered daily, a handful of models served as the foundation. In one early illustration, the artist sketched a woman in profile, her eyes slightly closed, her hair streaming down to form a question mark-like curl. He named it the Eternal Question. The woman in the sketch was Evelyn Nesbit, then just 16 years old and newly arrived in New York City. So enthralling was Evelyn's beauty that it not only became the basis for the feminine ideal of the early 20th century, but it was invoked to justify the murder of New York's most prominent and accomplished architect. Evelyn Nesbit was born on Christmas Day of 1884 in a small town outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. When she was just 8 years old, Evelyn's father died, leaving her mother to care for her and her younger brother Howard alone. Their mother turned the family home into a boarding house to make ends meet, but there were many days in which supper consisted of only bread and a smear of mustard. Evelyn often escaped into the world of fairy tales, enchanted by the fantasy of being rescued from poverty by some sort of magic spell or dashing hero. In 1899, the family moved to Philadelphia, and soon all three were working at Wanamaker's department store 6 days a week to make ends meet. Here, 14-year-old Evelyn was approached by an artist and asked to sit for a portrait. Her mother had always known that her daughter held an unusual beauty. Rare was a stranger who wouldn't turn to catch a second glimpse of her. Now, she saw a way to climb out of poverty using that beauty. Evelyn quickly became a favorite among Philadelphia's illustrators and painters. Within a year, the family relocated to New York City, armed with letters of introduction to artists like James Carroll Beckwith and Frederick S. Church. Before long, Evelyn was one of the most in-demand models in the city. But even though she was earning more than all three of the Nesbits had working at Wanamaker's, the cost of living continued to strain the family. Evelyn persuaded her mother to let her add theatre work to her repertoire, and in July of 1901, premiered as a Spanish maiden in the chorus line of Broadway's Florodora. In addition to earning more money, the theatre world introduced the rising star to an exclusive social scene. 6 other chorus girls on the set had married millionaires, and it wasn't unusual for the female performers to be showered with flowers and gifts from wealthy men. If there were ever a place to make her fairy tale come true, it was Broadway. The arts were one of the only avenues through which a poor girl from Pittsburgh could meet men with wealth, status, and privilege. This was, after all, the Gilded Age in New York City, where 1% of the families controlled 90% of the wealth. The Vanderbilts, the Astors, and the Carnegies lived in palatial Fifth Avenue mansions, while their employees lived in squalid tenements. This disparity in wealth has never ceased, but the ultra-rich have certainly gotten more subtle in the centuries since. Now, sleek modern mansions are hidden behind tall hedges and security gates. In New York, at the turn of the century, showing off your wealth was as important as the wealth itself. The wealthiest families lived in homes that comprised entire city blocks. Dozens of bedrooms, libraries full of thousands of rare volumes, collections of antique and exotic furniture and art, ballrooms that could accommodate 1,000 guests, and chandeliers dripping in jewels from soaring ceilings were all basic entry requirements for New York's Millionaire's Row. And many of these palace-like dwellings were the work of a single man, Stanford White. White was more than just an architect. He was the arbiter of taste among New York's upper class. Those looking to make their entrance into the upper echelons of New York City's elite turned to White to build, furnish, and decorate their homes. They also relied on him to design extravagant parties as social introductions. These over-the-top affairs were a way to flaunt one's home and belongings, with White ensuring everything remained in good taste. And when he wasn't filling Fifth Avenue mansions with antiques and arranging soirees, White was designing some of the most iconic structures in the US. Stanford and his architecture firm McKim, Mead & White were the genius behind the Washington Square Arch, the Metropolitan Club, the Boston Public Library, and Madison Square Garden Theatre, where White built himself a tower apartment below the rooftop cabaret. The luxury pad became one of the city's most exclusive and notorious dinner party locations. It was within those walls that Evelyn Nesbit found her bridge to the world of affluence. Though Stanford White was 47 years old and married, he had never stopped living the life of a young bachelor, and that included a keen interest in young, beautiful women. Soon after meeting Evelyn, White became her benefactor. He helped her gain connections on Broadway, paid for music lessons, and presented her with piles of books to read. Although Evelyn was initially not attracted to White in the physical sense, she was drawn to his humor, attentiveness, and easy nature. At the first party she attended at White's apartment, he showed her his infamous red velvet swing, suspended from the ceiling of his studio with ropes of ivy. White persuaded Evelyn to allow him to push her higher and higher until she kicked through the cover of a Japanese paper umbrella mounted near the ceiling. Evelyn later wrote of the red velvet swing, "It was amusing. I enjoyed it thoroughly. I did not realize that childish fun could have any serious significance. I did not realize that this prepossessing and kindly man could have any other object in view than to amuse me." Evelyn wasn't the only one who believed Stanford White's interest to be entirely innocent. Mrs. Nesbit was thrilled that such an important man had taken Evelyn into his care and encouraged the strange friendship. Within months, White had paid to move Evelyn's mother and brother out of their tiny apartment and into a luxurious hotel where he covered their expenses. He seemed like a guardian angel, and when Mrs. Nesbit returned to Pittsburgh to visit family, she gladly left 16-year-old Evelyn in White's care. While she was away, White took Evelyn to be photographed wearing rare Japanese kimonos from his private collection. It was during this period that Stanford's true motives were revealed. It's claimed that during the shoot, either due to drink or drugs, Evelyn passed out and Stanford took advantage of her. He would then spin this into a relationship of sorts, one that would turn deadly within a few short years. But she knew she was not the only girl the older man was involved with. Perhaps in an effort to make White jealous or simply keep her options open, Evelyn accepted invitations from many other eligible bachelors, of which there were no shortage. She dated a famous polo player, a magazine publisher's son, and numerous others. But the only suitor who really piqued her interest was John Barrymore, a popular actor from a respected theatrical family. Barrymore, at 21, was much closer to Nesbit's own age, and the pair quickly discovered that they had much in common. But both Stanford White and Evelyn's mother opposed the match and conceived a plan to send Evelyn to a boarding school in New Jersey to put a stop to the burgeoning romance. White and Barrymore were not the only men vying for her affections. During her time in the Broadway show The Wild Rose, a man calling himself Mr. Monroe attended more than 40 performances, often presenting Evelyn with lavish bouquets of long-stemmed roses afterwards. The admirer was really Harry Thaw, heir to a $40 million railroad fortune. Thaw struggled to gain acceptance in New York society and placed the blame for his outsider status firmly at the feet of Stanford White. He believed that White had blocked his acceptance into many social circles and was obsessed with proving that the successful architect was nothing more than a predator of young women. It's unknown for sure how much Thaw knew of her relationship with the architect when he began pursuing the girl, but it likely played at least some part in his decisions. Harry Thaw arranged a meeting with Evelyn to reveal his true identity, but she remained largely unimpressed. Wealthy men were now easy to come by, and Harry's reputation wasn't complimentary. Evelyn had undoubtedly heard that he was known as Mad Harry, thanks to his history of mental instability. She found the man strange in both behavior and appearance. He didn't have the connections of White or the looks of Barrymore, and therefore held little appeal for Evelyn. But the persistent Thaw was not to be dissuaded. In early 1903, Evelyn was at boarding school when she was forced to have emergency surgery for acute appendicitis. Harry Thaw immediately offered to pay for her medical care and began showering Evelyn with gifts and promises of love. He also paid Mrs. Nesbit a generous sum to win her over to his side and offered to finance a trip to Europe for the trio to allow Evelyn time to recover. Mrs. Nesbit agreed to the journey, but did not reveal to Stanford White that Evelyn had a second secret benefactor. Once on the other side of the Atlantic, Evelyn and her mother's relationship became frayed and tense. Thaw had not planned a relaxing getaway, but a frenetic romp across the continent. Mrs. Nesbit insisted on returning to the States, while Evelyn and Thaw continued on their own. In Paris, Thaw dressed Evelyn in haute couture and showered her with jewellery. He made introductions to royals, the rich, and the famous. He also began pressurizing Evelyn to marry him. But she was still wary of Thaw, who had become increasingly controlling and possessive of her. He would stand guard outside the door when she went to the ladies' room, overturn the entire table if something wasn't to his liking at a meal, and slip away for hours, returning with a crazed look, his eyes bulging. As he continued to hound her about accepting his proposal, Evelyn began to wonder if perhaps the only way to dissuade him for good was to tell him that she had already slept with someone else. She knew Thaw was obsessed with female virginity and believed that once he knew about her relationship with White, he would no longer want to marry her. After days of endless questioning over why she would not accept his proposal, Evelyn revealed the truth. Pushed for more details, she told Thaw how it had all begun 3 years before, when she had been invited to White's apartment while her mother was out of town. The architect had asked her to put on a kimono and given her champagne. This was her last memory until she woke up naked next to him. Evelyn had expected Harry Thaw to react with rage, anger, or revulsion. Instead, he wept. And in that moment, she felt something soften in her towards him. She saw gentleness and kindness. In reality, Thaw was likely completely unsurprised by Evelyn's revelation. He'd been paying detectives to trail White and knew more about the gregarious architect than Evelyn herself. He knew that White spent weekends with his wife Bessie and son Larry at their estate on Long Island, and his weekdays living a life of debauchery at one of his city residences. His evenings started at one of the clubs he belonged to, where he met the men for drinks. After, they'd all have dinner at Delmonico's or another exclusive New York restaurant. From there, White alternated between the theatre, the opera, boxing matches, and other entertainment. The nights would always end in one of White's so-called secret hideaways, where things would quickly turn sexual in nature. By the time he began wooing Evelyn in Europe, Harry Thaw had already reported Stanford White to the New York Society for Suppression of Vice, claiming that the man had used his secret hideaways to drug underage girls and then sexually assault them. According to him, White had done this to as many as 378 young women. From Paris, Thaw took Evelyn on a tour of Germany and then on to a secluded Gothic castle in Austria. He ordered that the 3 servants in residence stay at one end of the building and he and Evelyn on the other. If she had come to believe that Thaw was more sensitive and caring than she'd first thought, the stay at the castle would prove her wrong. For 2 weeks he kept Evelyn locked in a room and beat her until she was covered in painful welts. Eventually, Evelyn was able to free herself from Thaw and return to New York alone. But the same detectives hired to follow White were soon employed to track her down. Once back in the city, Harry Thaw resumed his persistent, obsessive courtship. Evelyn was in a precarious position. Thaw could reveal her affair with Stanford White at any moment, and she knew White could do nothing to protect her. He was, after all, a married man. She was now estranged from her mother and no longer trusted White. He had known of Mad Harry's reputation for abusing women and hadn't bothered to warn her. Thaw, on the other hand, seemed genuinely apologetic and eager to please her. He was now her surest path to a life free from the poverty that had plagued her childhood, and on April the 4th, 1905, Evelyn Nesbit and Harry Thaw were wed. The bride wore a black travelling suit. After they married, Thaw moved the couple to Pittsburgh to live with his mother. Evelyn was deeply unhappy with the situation, having imagined that their marriage would resemble the lavish, happier days of their European vacation. In New York, Stanford White's fortunes were turning too. Unknown to the society he helped to create, White was actually quite poor. A series of disastrous investments had left him with little in the bank, and he was forced to auction his art collection and antique furniture to shore up his finances. However, a warehouse fire destroyed the items before the sale. His health was deteriorating from the stress, and he had noticed that he was being followed by detectives. To appease his unhappy new bride, Thaw arranged a trip on a luxury ocean liner for a European holiday. The pair planned to spend a few days in New York before departing. On the evening of June the 26th, 1906, the pair dined at Café Martin. By chance, Stanford White was also dining there, though they did not socialize. After their meal, Evelyn and Thaw continued to the Madison Square Garden rooftop theatre with friends to see the premiere of Mademoiselle Champagne. None of them particularly enjoyed the show, and all agreed to duck out early in search of better entertainment. As they headed toward the elevator, Thaw slipped away into the crowd. Moments later, gunshots ripped through the night air. When Evelyn finally spotted her husband, his arm was outstretched, holding a pistol. It was aimed at Stanford White, who sat slumped and bloodied in his chair. Though there was no question that Harry Thaw had killed Stanford White, the public's reaction was largely sympathetic to Thaw. In death, White's questionable morals were viewed as vindication for the killing, and his contributions to the excesses of New York society were scrutinized. Never mind that Harry Thaw was dining on squabbed champagne in his prison cell. He had only avenged the horrific treatment his beautiful young bride had endured at the hands of Stanford White. The murder trial began on January 23, 1907, in a courtroom packed with an unprecedented number of lawyers, reporters, and illustrators. Thaw's defense team hoped to prove that their client was temporarily insane, traumatized by Evelyn's recounting of the date rape she'd endured at the hands of Stanford White. 22-year-old Evelyn was the star witness. She recounted drinking bitter-tasting champagne and the world going black. As she spoke, Thaw sobbed into his hands. It is believed by many that Evelyn was offered significant compensation from the Thaw family for her testimony. After 11 weeks, the trial concluded with a deadlocked jury. When the second trial began, Thaw's attorneys changed their tactic, claiming that Thaw was outright insane, having suffered from severe mental health problems since childhood. His mother testified to a family history of mental illness. The strategy was effective, and the defendant was found not guilty by reason of insanity and sent to a prison for the criminally insane. Large crowds who believed him a hero who redeemed his wife's virtue cheered him on his way. He would spend a total of 7 years in prison before being declared sane and released. In 1910, Evelyn gave birth to a son, Russell William Thaw, who she maintained was Harry's biological child, conceived during a conjugal visit, though he denied paternity. Evelyn went on to reconcile with her mother after the Thaws virtually abandoned her. She found success in vaudeville and starred in several popular silent films. She and Thaw divorced in 1915, and Evelyn married her dance partner Jack Clifford. Though their stage act drew enormous crowds, their marriage suffered from Clifford's insecurities around Evelyn's notoriety, and they too eventually divorced. Her later career was varied, to say the least. She was briefly the proprietor of a tea room, played clubs and cabarets across the country, did a burlesque act in Panama, and taught classes in sculpting and ceramics. She struggled with drug addiction and attempted to take her own life at least once. She remained entangled with Harry Thaw, with reconciliation rumors swirling in the media until Thaw died in 1947. The millionaire bequeathed $10,000 to his ex-wife in his will. Evelyn herself died in a nursing home in Santa Monica, California in 1967 at the age of 82. She claimed that Stanford White was the only man she had ever loved. But did the Gibson Girl, seen only for her beauty, steered through life by two men who cared only for their own material desires, ever really have a chance to experience true love? Thank you for watching. Right then, take care, and I'll see you next time with another story to make you say, well, I never.